All right, let's get right into this explainer. Have you ever stopped to wonder why one storm is just, an interesting weather event, while another storm of the exact same size turns into a devastating catastrophe? Today, we are going to systematically decode the anatomy of a catastrophe. We're going to explore the entire life cycle of a disaster, starting from the exact moment a physical threat materializes, moving to the human choices that amplify it, all the way down to its really heartbreaking aftermath. To help us do this, we'll be drawing on some incredibly solid educational source material from Study IQ, which introduces the core concepts of hazards and disasters. Now, while the original text is bilingual, our goal for today is to take these exact foundational concepts and systematically break them down so we can truly understand the underlying mechanics of these catastrophic events.
So, here is our roadmap for today's explainer. We'll kick things off by defining the hazard, then classifying the threats. After that, we'll dive into understanding human vulnerability, look at the tipping point of hazard versus disaster, and finally, we'll cover impacts and aftermath.
Okay, let's start with Section 1, defining the hazard.
We tend to toss the words hazard and disaster around interchangeably in everyday conversation, right? But scientifically speaking, they are very different things. A hazard is defined as a potentially dangerous situation or a series of events with the potential to cause disruption or damage to life, property, and the environment. And the absolute most important word in that entire definition is potentially. A hazard just represents the threat of harm. Think of it like a loaded spring. It has all that stored energy, but it hasn't necessarily snapped yet.
The crucial point here is captured absolutely perfectly in this specific example from our source material. It says, a large earthquake in an unpopulated location is a natural occurrence and not a hazard. I mean, think about it. If the ground is shaking violently out of the middle of a completely empty, barren wasteland, and there are literally zero humans, zero property, and no vital environments in its path, well, it's just geology doing its thing in action. To officially be a hazard, it strictly requires the potential for human harm, property damage, or some kind of social and economic disruption. Moving right along to Section 2. Classifying the threats. Once we actually recognize a hazard, we have to figure out how to categorize it. And what's really vital to keep in mind here is that hazards occur at wildly different intensities and cover different areas. A tornado might just hit a single town, right? But a drought could blanket an entire region. Plus, they originate from three very distinct places. First up, we have natural hazards. These have a meteorological, geological, or biological origin. So think your cyclones, tsunamis, or earthquakes. Second, we have man-made hazards. These are human-caused or technological. A classic example would be the accidental release of radiation from a nuclear installation. And that brilliantly illustrates our third category, quasi-natural hazards. These happen through the direct interaction between natural processes and human activities. Smog and desertification are perfect examples of this. It's where natural weather patterns combine directly with human pollution or land mismanagement to create an entirely new hazard.
Which brings us to Section 3. Understanding human vulnerability. Now, before we look at the data, I want you to just ask yourself, what makes one community more at risk than another? Seriously, if the exact same category for a cyclone hits two completely different coastal cities, why does one city bounce back in a week, while the other is left completely devastated for a decade? Well, the answer lies entirely in their vulnerability. Our source material actually breaks down the specific factors that influence this vulnerability. Obviously, it starts with physical proximity and population density, like how close are you to the hazard and how densely packed are the people living there. But then, it moves into our societal choices, things like the scientific understanding of the hazard, public education, and general awareness. Think about how the existence, or totally lacking existence, of early warning systems and communication lines can completely change the outcome of a tsunami. It also comes down to the readiness of emergency infrastructure and even cultural factors that influence how the public actually responds to those warnings.
We can neatly organize all these factors into three distinct types of vulnerability. Physical vulnerability depends on the location of the people and the actual technical capacity of their buildings and infrastructure. Ecological vulnerability refers to environmental imbalances that just make a certain area more susceptible. But the absolute starkest reality presented in the text is economic vulnerability. The inescapable truth here is that poor populations are significantly more vulnerable. They are so often forced to live in much more dangerous areas, in houses built out of weaker materials, completely lacking the resources to prepare or evacuate.
All right, Section 4, Hazard versus Disaster.
So here is the definitive threshold. A disaster is defined as a sudden, catastrophic event causing widespread disruption to a community or region, resulting in significant demographic, economic, or environmental losses. But I want you to pay really close attention to this final phrase, where the affected community is unable to deal adequately without outside help. That right there is the defining metric. If a town gets flooded, but the local emergency services step up, handle it, fix it, and recover independently, that was a severe hazard. But if that local system completely collapses and requires federal or international intervention just to survive, that is when it becomes a disaster.
To really clarify the exact differences in severity and duration, just consider this comparison. A hazard generally has less critical consequences, and it might actually build up over a number of events. A disaster, by stark contrast, has highly critical, truly catastrophic consequences, and crucially, it occurs in a very short span of time. It is that sheer suddenness that completely overwhelms a community's capacity to cope. Now, the source material goes on to formally classify these events, and it does so in some very specific and maybe even surprising ways. We're just presenting these categorizations neutrally, exactly as they appear in the original educational text here. For example, floods, cyclones, droughts, and even earthquakes are grouped under minor natural disasters. Meanwhile, the setting of fires, deforestation, and chemical pollution are categorized as major man-made disasters. Furthermore, the text categorizes events like wars, riots, road accidents, and food poisoning strictly under minor man-made disasters. It's definitely a fascinating look at exactly how institutional curricula frame these varying magnitudes of crises.
And finally, Section 5. Impacts and aftermath.
Once the event has finally passed and outside help has actually arrived, the reality of the disaster is still far from over. The immediate aftermath triggers a total cascade of severe economic impacts. Beyond the obvious physical toll on the human body, there's a massive psychological impact to deal with. Communities immediately face shortages of food and basic natural resources. The source specifically highlights the terrible plight of the displaced population, because when people are completely uprooted and forced into new settlements, they encounter numerous massive difficulties, which frequently causes already impoverished populations to become even further destitute. The economic floor basically completely drops out from beneath them. And alongside that economic ruin, there are profound social and environmental impacts too. As we wrap up the core content of this explainer, we really have to look at the long-term scarring. Disasters literally change the ecosystem. They cause massive habitat loss for plants and animals, which leads to intense, sustained ecological stress. And the ultimate end result of all this environmental trauma? It's a measurable decline in regional biodiversity. The landscape itself is just fundamentally altered.
So we are left with a pretty powerful realization here. The hazards themselves, the storms, the shifting tectonic plates, those are inevitable. But the disaster? The disaster is not. If our vulnerability is largely defined by human choices, from economic inequality all the way to early warning systems, how can we proactively change our infrastructure and our culture to stop natural hazards from inevitably becoming human disasters? It's a massive challenge for sure, but truly understanding the anatomy of a catastrophe is the first crucial step. Thanks for joining me for this explainer, and keep questioning the world around you.